understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? The sun is up high in the sky. It is the Mediterranean summer. We are being lashed on, but John is sunning himself in his new French idyll in the hills. How is it? You're still there.
It's fabulous. I think the sun is getting to me, actually. My brain is getting fried daily, and I'm not thinking straight.
And I see you're also involved in a culture war.
Yeah, after our comments, or my comments last week about Project 2025, it seemed to spark a debate, certainly amongst my crew, and there was lots of stuff flying around the place, which I thought was great and funny. But also, what was interesting, though, your man J.D. Vance made this comment, horrible comment, about women and, what did he call them?
Childless cat ladies.
A bunch of childless cat ladies, exactly, because they couldn't or didn't have children and they may have turned to, IVF or whatever. But what a horrible thing to say. But that story appeared on RTE News. I'm not having a go at RTE News per se.
Go on, have a go at them. Have a go at them. They've just got the biggest, hold on, wait a second. RTE News, John, have just got the biggest lump sum of a transfer from the taxpayer, right?
Yes.
We should get a bloody lump sum. We're doing public sector broadcasting.
Absolutely. But this story appeared on the RTE News entertainment section as if it was some sort of trivial story. The whole idea of J.D. Vance, his attitude and the MAGA attitude towards women and their anti-abortion and their anti-contraception even is frightening. And this whole Project 2025 thing, people need to know about it. For instance, what I didn't mention last week as well is...
By the way, he's really going for it. He's really going for it.
But one of the things is, one of the plans is to rename the Department of Education to the Department of American Values. That speaks volumes. This should be screamed from every rooftop, this fascist playbook that is about to be implemented if they get elected.
J.D. Vance, the Bishop Eamon Casey of vice presidents. That's who he is. Anyway,
yes, he is.
Interestingly, there is another alternative view. There is another alternative view, which is, Trump gets in, he does a deal with Putin over Ukraine. Ukraine is divided. The two of them sit down and they reinstate détente as it was in the 1970s, basically spheres of influence. The Chinese come in on board with that. Just think this idea, right? And say, okay, that's cool. So you have détente, you've got the Russian sphere of influence, the Western European sphere of influence. Ukraine becomes partitioned in the sense that the eastern part goes off to Russia. The war ends. So people are not being killed.
Yeah.
They sit down. They basically say, okay, we're back to the 1970s again, right? Where you've got the big powers armed with nuclear weapons. The Chinese come in on the back of that. The Europeans say, okay, that's fine. The Americans say, look, we will look after you, but you'll pay a little bit more. But we're actually going to that there are people who believe that is the playbook of the Trumpian MAGA playbook. And it could lead, John, to world peace.
Oh, it could, but at a huge cost to society and to real freedom. Real freedom.
Well, I'm just putting it out there. What we're going to talk today, John, is about inheritance.
Right.
Not just inheritance, the legacy of one's background, okay, and how it changes you. And we're going to talk about the inheritance of Kamala Harris from her father, who was a very eminent Marxist economist called Donald Harris, who was an emeritus professor of Stanford. Now, so it's not some Mickey Mouse college. We're talking Stanford, one of the Ivy League colleges in America.
Right,
Interesting how that's changed her thinking. So that's sort of intellectual inheritance. And then the other part is the material inheritance, commercial inheritance, the sort of stuff that's bubbling under the surface now in Ireland, whereas people are saying, what should our inheritance tax be? Should it be increased? Should it be decreased? All that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
What I find really bizarre in Ireland, we've got to this stage now, the discussion inheritance tax in Ireland, it basically has zeroed in on this idea that certain people are now too wealthy to pay tax. And by that I mean, the house prices have gone up so much that if some poor misfortune inherits a big, big house. They have to pay a dollop of tax on that and they can't afford it. So Ireland has gone from a situation where we were poor and full of immigrants to rich, full of migrants, immigrants, and the middle class are too rich to pay tax. How do we get there? That's what it's going to be all about.
Okay. Where do we start?
Well, we can start with Eamon Casey.
No.
But we won't. We won't. But what I found fascinating about Kamala Harris is the way in which both herself and Barack Obama have a very, very strikingly similar intellectual heritage. So both their fathers, in the case of Barack Obama Sr., and in the case of Kamala Harris, Donald Harris, became economists in the 1960s and 70s. They were the very first generation of post-colonial economists who emerged out of colonialism, who emerged out of, in the case of Harris, Jamaica, and in the case of Obama, Kenya. And both of them served in those first post-colonial governments and advised them. So it's always fascinating for me, John, is sometimes when you talk to Irish people about economics, right? And about wealth and about how it should be spread around and international capital and multinationals and the relationship between capital and labor. I don't think we should ever, ever underestimate the extent to which post-colonial worldviews has informed the Irish psyche that puts us not a million miles away from post-colonial Jamaicans, post-colonial Kenyans, etc., from an intellectual basis, which might explain a lot of why Ireland's political system isn't like left and right. It's a sort of a melange in the middle of some sort of bizarre, hard to explain. When you talk to particularly Brits or French people, it's very, very hard, or even Yanks, it's hard to explain our political system to them. But they don't have that profound post-colonial feel. Even though the Americans were a colony, the founding fathers established an actual, real document, federal papers, and then the Constitution, and they became a huge recipient of immigrants. So their sort of melting pot's different. So I've always thought it's fascinating to see where these legacies come from, because if you think about Kamala Harris and Obama, right? Both their dads would be regarded now as very radical, particularly Kamala Harris's dad. Kamala Harris's dad was known as a Marxist in Stanford. And the Stanford magazine warned students that he would lead them away like the Pied Piper. This is a quote from the truth of neoclassical economics.
Was he subject to McCarthyism then? He must have been.
No, he was after McCarthy. So he came to the United States in the 1960s from Jamaica. And so basically what happened is, in the same way in Ireland, and if you look at the history of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, the Irish Department of Finance, they were, in a sense, moored by or anchored to a post-colonial worldview. It's a very simple idea. How do you create a state when all the money leaves? Because you forget that when the colonists leave the country, they don't just leave themselves, but they take all their money with them.
Yeah,
and they take their capital,
all the goodies.
and they take their networks. So you're kind of starting again. And of course, Ireland is a little bit unusual in the sense that most post-colonial countries started with Marx. We started with, I would say, St. Paul.
Yes, right? At the crossroads with De Valera.
Exactly, at the on the crucifix, at the crossroads. You know, the bizarre thing about Ireland is, one, that we remained a democracy through the post-colonial transition, which is almost unheard of.
Right.
And number two, that we became a theocracy, which is, again, something that is unusual. And number three is we didn't embrace Marx. We embraced the apostles. We embraced the four evangelists, right? Yeah. Which is kind of bonkers.
They were great economists, those fellas.
Great economists. They were great. They were fantastic. They were like Fibonacci, John. Created the L sequences. But what is fascinating is that when you look at Irish attitudes, let's say, for example, with Palestine and Gaza now, okay, or with any post-colonial situation, we identify always with the colonized people. And that permeates into the way we look at economics, the way we look at politics, philosophy.
And geopolitics.
And this is why I think it's very, very difficult for, right-wing movements to get a really strong grip here, because the natural tendency is to favor the underdog. Now, that might be changing, and we'll see how that goes. But up until now, in the 100 years since independence, natural tendency has to be the underdog is always right, even when they're wrong.
Yeah.
Like sometimes the victim can also be a bit of a bollocks.
Yeah.
But our view is default. And I was looking at Kamala Harris's dad's recent work. Well, it's not recent work from the 1970s and 80s. And it is a radical Marxist interpretation of the world. So it's very suspicious of foreign capital. It's all about controlling your own resources and putting those resources into national hands, not private hands. And it's all about, his idea was, he said something very interesting. He said, there is no reason to believe that a black man would be treated better by a black owner of capital than a white owner of capital. So his idea was that they were trying to get into this kind of post-racist society, and Obama's dad as well, to say, in fact, we're going to go beyond race and we're going to focus on what we feel is the real problem. And both of them felt the real problem was capitalism.
Yeah.
And what is fascinating now is that the capitalism that Barack Obama espoused and the capitalism that Kamala Harris espouses are the polar opposite to what their parents and their fathers would have espoused and would have actually drilled into them. So the fascinating thing is that although Kamala Harris is the inheritor of Barack Obama, it's very, very clear. And that's the way they're going to position her in the election, that she's basically a direct line from Obama in effect, right?
Yeah.
Both of them, the son and daughter of radicals, are much, much more centrist. And the ideas that Barack Obama and Kamala Harris espouse are very much anti the ideas of their parents. And it's quite funny. You've said it to me before, how conservative parents tend to spawn liberal children.
Yes.
And liberal parents. It's so basically American politics is like Absolutely Fabulous, right? Do you remember Absolutely Fabulous?
I do. Fab. Yeah.
Yeah. Where the mothers were more Larry than the daughters. The daughters were really square, and the mothers. So it's the same sort of idea. But the interesting thing is, whereas intellectual and moral inheritance can be ambivalent, and lots of kids rebel against their parents, commercial inheritance tends to be much more straightforward.
Go on, explain that.
Which is why you have great series called Succession.
Oh,
that
yes.
It's very rare that a son or daughter will say, look, dad and mum with your lots of big money, don't you worry, I'll reject all that and I'll feck off and live in the wilderness.
Yeah.
It's much more likely that they end up in a dogfight with their own siblings.
Yeah.
And that's why the best story
Loyalty's
in the Bible
out the window at that stage.
Exactly. That's why the best story in the Bible is Cain and Abel. It's all brilliant. It's like sibling rivalry, right?
Yeah.
And all the way up from Cain and Abel, John, to Logan Roy. It's all the same. It is the story of succession. And that's what I want to focus on today. Okay.
Brilliant. Without the language, of course.
Well, I loved Logan's language. I also loved his rap. One of the finest raps ever.
Yeah.
We should actually fuse Logan Roy with Kneecap to see what comes out, you know? Anyway, so that's what we're going to talk about. Inheritance tax, John, right? And I know that this is something that inflames you.
Well, it's a funny thing about inheritance in general, because it is a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, you have the parents working their arses off all their lives to pass on to your kids. That is a natural instinct to want your kids to do well, especially if they sacrifice, time with their kids all the way through their life, and they pass it on. So they'll have a slightly easier life than they had. But you're right, on the flip side of it, then it concentrates money within a certain group of people. And that seems unfair for everybody else. So I'm a bit stuck on this. I'm really torn on this one.
Well, John, remain torn, because one of the takeaways of economics and thinking about it and writing it over the years is that societies are very complex.
Yeah.
So dogmatic people, whether they be St. Paul or Che Guevara, can't understand the subtleties. They always believe there's a goodie, there's a baddie, there's a right, there's a wrong, there's a black, there's a white. And I think the key thing about complex societies is that 4 or 5 things can be right at the same time.
Right. Okay.
And in fact, you could argue that the essential ingredient of a dynamic economy is for 2 or 3 stories to be playing out all the time. 2 or 3 narratives that people can actually think about, align behind, subscribe to, etc. And inheritance tax, as you put your finger on, is exactly that sort of thing. Because if we were Donald Harris, as opposed to Kamala Harris, right?
Yeah.
Donald Harris would see this as a very, very simple black and white issue, that democracy is inconsistent with inheritance. That you can have, as quoted by Roosevelt, you can have inequality and democracy, but you can't have both eventually.
Right.
This is your idea that at its core, inheritance betrays the essential promise of democracy, which is a fair crack of the whip, based on meritocracy, based on ability, based on hard work. And ultimately what it does is it gives a leg up to those who don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Okay. And that would be the Donald Harris worldview. So what you do there is you tax it to the hilt. That's the left-wing view. Fascinatingly, John, on the right wing, on the libertarian right, they also conclude in that area. So the libertarian right, who believe that every citizen should have, when they come into this world, a blank slate, and you start there. Yeah. They also, amazingly, think that inheritance tax should be taxed at 100%. So bizarrely, the extreme right and the extreme left, the libertarians and the Marxists, arrive at the same conclusion. The libertarians, because they want to level the playing field to give everybody the same chance so that people can actually achieve their potential.
Yeah.
The Marxist left, because they want to level the playing field so that everybody can be equal. So the libertarians start with equality so that everybody can be unequal. And the Marxists started equality so everyone can end up equal.
Right. Okay.
Typically, most of us are not in those extremes. Typically, most of us are somewhere in the middle. And as you said, there is this trade-off between, is inheritance tax in essence a disguised jealousy tax to penalize those who've done well and penalize the offspring of those who've done well? Or is it essentially a foundational pillar of democracy to even out the spoils? Now, I think this is kind of fascinating. And that's why I think that inheritance tax is one of the most interesting taxes, because the debate about it really reveals how you think the world works and really reveals how you think the society works and what the society should be. And in fact, over the coming little while, people in Ireland will be focusing on inheritance tax precisely because the government has raised this flag that it will increase the thresholds, i.e. decrease inheritance tax in Ireland.
Right. And what would that do? So, I mean, do you remember last year we were doing our focus on the various different European countries? On one particular episode, we focused on Italy, and inheritance tax came up. That subject came up in Italy because Berlusconi wanted to eliminate all inheritance tax. In other words, keep the rich rich.
Yeah.
So what happened then from that?
Good question. Yeah, good question. So basically, I think your fundamental observation is the right one, which is that rich people don't like inheritance tax because they get taxed.
Yeah.
And poor people like inheritance tax because they don't inherit anything in the main.
Yeah.
So it's a very simple divide. And it wouldn't come as any surprise to anyone that Silvio Berlusconi, the man who, a bit like Trump, half Italians voted for Berlusconi, right? I have never met an Italian who claims they voted for Silvio. Yet half of them did. So some of them are lying, right? It's the same thing as Trump. You know the way Trump used to, before the last election, there was always this gap between the polls and his outcome, because people wouldn't tell pollsters they were voting for Trump, and they, in the privacy of their own box, they go in and they vote for him, right? So Berlusconi reduced Italian inheritance tax to zero. And what this meant was that the Italians who were very, very wealthy remained very, very wealthy.
Yeah.
Now, one of the extraordinary facets of Italian economic history, John, is the following. If you look at the wealthy families in Florence in the 13th century, amazingly, 7 centuries later, so 700 years later, the same families are still very wealthy in Florence.
Yeah.
So basically, the Florentines were able to hang on to their wealth through many, many generations, which is an amazing thing. So Italy has been characterized by a lot of wealth retention. And Berlusconi, because he made money quickly on media, on TV and sports and whatever, decided he was going to join that gang.
Yeah.
So what we were talking about in Italy was that Italy felt very sclerotic in the sense that there are lots and lots of young people who can't get a break in Italy. They can't catch a break, so they end up in London, they end up in Dublin, whatever. And the older, wealthier Italians have really got a stake in society, which was made much, much more substantial by the fact that their assets can't be taxed. So I think that's what the point they're making is that if you reduce inheritance tax to zero, you reward the children and grandchildren of the very wealthy, which solidifies the class system and which makes advancement quite difficult for other people. So that's the essential argument. And that's what some Italian commentators suggest has happened in Italy. In the case of Ireland, we didn't have rich people like Florence 700 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So there isn't that cohort. But it's very, very clear that at the moment, there is a phenomenal amount of wealth being created in Ireland. Again, through housing, through new companies, through share options, all that sort of stuff, right? There's a phenomenal amount of new wealth. And you notice that because the stockbrokers or wealth managers are employing all the time around Dublin. So you know that something's going on. And they will be lobbying very hard, the government, to say no inheritance tax or reduce it. The fascinating part of it, and I think the very Irish part of it, is the following. House prices have increased by 62% since the trough of 2012. That has meant that a significant amount of middle-class people are about to come into, when their parents pass away, a massively increased value of the family home.
Yeah.
But a lot of these people don't have a massive income, right? So their wages are above average, but not particularly. And this is the great thing about Ireland. We are now having a tax debate because the really rich are too poor to pay tax. So if you think about this, this is the difference between cash and wealth, between liquidity and illiquidity, right? So what is happening is the rich people who vote for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, they are saying to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, look, the house we were brought up in has gone up in value by 200,000 or 300,000 euros. So let's say the house has gone up in value, so it's worth £1 million. So we have there's a cutoff point, which I think is about 350,000. And over that 350,000, you pay on the difference between 350,000 and the amount of money you inherit, you pay 33%. So just say you are the only, this is like, again, it's kind of ridiculous. We're having this lament for a very rich person, but let's do it nonetheless. You're the only child of a couple, a mum and dad, who have just passed away, and the house that you have just inherited, which your parents bought for 100 grand or 50 grand, is now worth £1 million.
Yeah.
So on the 350 grand you get, that's fine. That means you've got to pay tax on 650, and you've got to pay tax at 30%. So that means you've got to come up with 200 grand in cash in order to keep the house, right?
Yeah.
So basically, you are very rich on paper, but you're not very rich in reality. So what you're saying is, why should I have to sell that house in order to pay the capital gains tax? And the state is saying, well, that's how you create churn in the market. That's how you create opportunities for other people to buy those houses. And that's where we're at the moment.
So a couple of things on that. On one hand, I can see the benefit of getting more houses back on the market.
Yeah.
Because we're in need of houses. So that's number one. But number two, is it a problem with the inheritance tax in itself that it's really unsophisticated? It's a real blunt instrument. Like, for instance, why does it need to be paid all at once and straight away? Is that not a tax that could be paid over
You're absolutely
5
right.
or 10 years,
right.
like a mortgage or whatever?
This is I was about to say the amortization, John, right?
Right.
The amortization. And the interesting thing about mortgage, you know, the mort bit in mortgage and the mort bit in amortization, you know what it comes from? It comes from death, because it's a French word. So these were debts that were gradually paid back over time. Right. And if you died, the person who lent you the money got the asset, right? That's the mortgage part of it. So that's the mort. That's the mort subite, the sudden death, John, which is the great cafe in Brussels that Jacques Brel used to hang out and drink in. But that's for We'll have to go to the mort subite one of these days. Anyway.
I was at a Jack Brel tribute gig up in the village here.
Oh, fantastic.
There was a Belgian beer festival and a Jack Brel singer. It was
John
great crack.
Yeah, I can hear you singing, Ne quitte pas, don't leave me. Okay. One of the great Jack Brel songs. Anyway, enough of our Belgian crooners, and let's go back to this issue. So what I think is you have this bizarre situation where inheritance tax has to be part of the democratic and equality agenda. But as you said, it needs to be less blunt than it is. It needs to be amortized over years, et cetera, et cetera. Or you can just say, well, look, you know what? You've just inherited £1 million. You're hardly the constituency that most needs looking after. And you can just say, off you go, sell the asset and move. Or sell the house you have, if you're the kid, to move into the mum and dad's house. Just sell everything. But of course, nobody in Ireland wants to sell property at the moment because it's going up so quickly and everyone looks at property as their nest egg. Back to that idea, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So people want to accumulate property all the time because what they think is that in a reasonably high inflationary environment where house prices are rising quickly, wouldn't I be mad to sell? Wouldn't it be better to hold on? And therefore, what they want to do is they want to accumulate property rather than sell property. And fascinatingly, this is where Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have ended up, in the corner of very rich people who were too poor to pay taxes.
Okay, just before we go to a break, Mac, we should look at how inheritance tax can be both an incentive and a disincentive for the younger generation coming up. But let's have a look at that after this. So, Mac, inheritance tax, it's like this, as we were talking, this double-edged sword, kind of penalizes some people, both rich and poor, ironically. But what's the solution here? Like, how should we look at inheritance tax going forward?
Look, I think that you need an inheritance tax in society to make sure that the state at least is trying to reduce the accumulation of wealth at extreme levels at the very, very top. Because we know that that leads to social insecurity. Fascinatingly, what we know from survey after survey, and this is interesting, is that people are not that pissed off about inequality and wealth inequality. They're not waking up every morning saying, see that rich guy, I want to, take him down a peg or two.
Yeah.
But what they are upset is about permanence of wealth inequality. So if there is a perception that you can go from being poor to being rich, but you can also go from being rich to being poor, people think the system is fair. So that you throw the dice in life, you have whatever, 70 years here or whatever you happen to have, or 80 years or, whatever. And you make the best of it, then that's great. And nobody resents that.
Yeah.
But what they do resent is if that wealth then solidifies in that family over years. So the reason the Americans up until now have always been quite flexible with people getting rich very quickly, there was a perception you can also get poor very quickly in America. You can go from rags to riches and back to rags again. So that story of rags to riches, back to rags, has a sort of an inbuilt morality that people quite like. And that comes back to your effort and you taking your chances and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
What people dislike is the situation that evolved in Italy, where the Florentine merchant princes remained rich for many, many, many years, right? That's what annoys people more than anything else. And that's why, of course, the Florentine merchant princes have constantly tried to do all sorts of good deeds and good acts of public works and all that sort of stuff, which is basically to deflect from the fact they still own all the goodies that was actually accumulated in the 13th and 14th century, before the Black Death, John. Not after it, before the Black Death.
Can I ask you though, Mac, inheritance tax can be seen as a kind of a double taxation. It's money you've already paid tax on throughout your life, and now you're asked to pay more on it. But because it's such a tricky tax and a tricky way to, what is the right way to deal with this, is it possible to actually take inheritance tax, or whatever the level is, whether it's 30% or 50% or 10%, but ring fence it in some sort of way so that it's used like as an innovation fund, similar to the wealth fund that you spoke about before, or to put into an education fund where that reduces college fees or student loans, that boosts on a more equal level the younger generation coming through.
Well, you could, but I think that would probably, I'd see where you're going with it and I see you're getting at, but I think that might overcomplicate the issue. I think we go back to the innovation idea, right?
Yeah.
That this country will only become stable, and I mean that stable in the sense avoiding massive booms and busts, which we are inherently very, very good at, is if people stop hoarding land and if we try and incentivize using money for more productive purposes. Now, a way then you could get to this is you could say, right, okay, inheritance tax on land as wealth will be higher than inheritance tax on companies as wealth, productive companies. Not just shell companies that are made up by clever accountants, but companies that have employees, that have products, etc. So, for example, if the person goes out and in their life innovates, creates new companies, creates employment, etc., the tax, the penalty on that when you die is going to be less than if you just go out and keep buying up property and property and property, because property and property and property doesn't create any innovation, doesn't create very much employment, and certainly is money tied up unproductively, right?
Yeah.
So I think something like that could be more interesting. So what you're saying is you're creating a tax system, which will be quite innovative, that actually doesn't start at life, but starts at death. And actually by targeting perceptions of how people lived, you change perceptions of how the economy should develop. And so you would tax those people who just inherit land more than those people who inherit shares or a company or a factory or whatever it happens to be. And in that, what you do is you keep the idea of working hard for your kids as a massive, massive boosting force for all society. But you dampen down the prospects of people hoarding land. And the reason you do this is because the higher land prices go, the more social unrest we have. Because the more people are excluded from the game and the more people feel they're locked out. And when they feel they're locked out, as we always say, they don't have a stake, but they have a vote. Then suddenly your political economy goes off into a different orbit and you end up at radicalism, which I don't think is where we want to go, despite the fact that we started this podcast about a great radical, Kamala Harris's dad, Donald Harris. Radicalism is great in academia. Keep it there. And let's keep the real world for the centrists, where life is complex, a little bit complicated, and never black and white.